It's long been established that the Victorian AFL teams have more advantages than disadvantages over their interstate counterparts. They travel significantly less, the grand final is played at the MCG every year, and they receive all of the marquee games and time slots for most of the year. But does one team have a greater advantage over all others? I'm Ryan from AFL Access, and we're about to find out who the most advantaged team in the AFL is. At first glance, majority of supporters would claim that one of the 4 MCG tenants would hold the greatest advantage over the rest of the competition due to the grand final being played there. And it certainly does hold some merit. Since 2013, 4 of the last 6 premiers have been MCG tenants. Those are some nice numbers, but let's look a bit deeper. When looking back even further, since the AFL came into existence in 1990, only 11 of the last 29 premiers have come from the home of football, bearing in mind that some of the Melbourne-based teams moved to the Dockland Stadium as their home ground. That's a more damning statistic against this notion, with the only MCG tenant having achieved any prolonged success being Hawthorn. In fact, 8 of the last 20 grand finals featuring an MCG tenant against a non-MCG tenant has resulted in a loss. That's a 40% losing ratio, which doesn't really correlate to a huge advantage. So, we can statistically rule out the MCG-based teams as having the greatest advantage over the rest of the competition. In saying that, they have a clear advantage over the rest of the Melbourne-based teams, whom only Essendon and the Western Bulldogs having won premierships since moving their home ground. Geelong is a strange case, having participated in 3 of the first 6 grand finals in the AFL era, losing to an interstate team twice and an MCG tenant once, and then attending another 4 of 5 grand finals roughly 10 years ago, winning 2 against non-MCG tenants, winning 1 against a tenant, and losing 1 against a non-tenant. So, of the 3 grand finals where they faced off against a tenant of the MCG, they have a 67% losing ratio in the AFL era. It is perhaps from Geelong that we can learn that having your home ground as the MCG has its greatest advantage against Victorian opponents. Of the 12 grand finals that an MCG tenant has faced off against an interstate opponent, they have won on only 6 occasions, which, if you suck at math, is a 50% winning ratio. That's significantly worse than the 75% winning ratio when against Victorian sides not based at the home of football. So, we can deduce that being a tenant of the MCG is only an advantage when coming up against other Victorian sides, but not against the interstate teams. It could be argued that simply making 20 of the 29 AFL era grand finals is an advantage unto itself. But when you look at it a bit closely, you see that when the Docklands opened and some teams moved their home grounds, this spread is fairly even among just Victorian teams in general, and as we established before, they have much less travel than interstate teams. What about the interstate teams? For now, I think we can rule out GWS and Gold Coast, as they have too little sample size and no grand final appearances to draw from. We can also rule out Fremantle and Port Adelaide, as they haven't made the big dance enough to draw any meaningful statistics from them, although they will make up some of the overall interstate stats. It's quite well known that Adelaide, Brisbane, Sydney and West Coast are the most successful interstate teams. They make up 18 appearances of the 20 grand finals featuring at least one interstate team. As it currently stands, I think we can rule out Brisbane. Despite having the greatest winning percentage of any interstate team in a grand final, it was done in a 4-year time span 15 years ago. So although it was one of the best runs of all time, they clearly don't have an advantage over the rest of the competition, considering they've been struggling on field both before and after this golden era. Adelaide have a winning percentage of 67%, but haven't won a grand final in 2 decades, losing their only appearance since by 8 goals. It's also a small sample size of 3 grand finals, so it's difficult to draw any concrete conclusions on the statistics. It's safe to say though that they have no clear advantage. Sydney have appeared in 6 grand finals in the AFL era, but have only won 2 of them, which would suggest that they are an incredibly well-run organisation, but don't have any advantage. West Coast are an interesting case. Statistically speaking, they have appeared in 7 grand finals, winning 4 of them. That gives them a 57% winning ratio, and makes them the second best performing team of the AFL era, behind Hawthorn, who boasts a mind-boggling 83% winning ratio in a grand final. I'll touch on Hawthorn a bit later though. In my opinion, West Coast holds the biggest advantage over the rest of the competition. And before you get your pitchforks, hear me out. As an interstate team, they hold a huge home ground advantage for 10 games a year. That's taking into account that they play Fremantle as an 11th home game. If they win 70 to 80% of these games, then they only need to win 50 to 60% of their interstate games to make finals in most years. And that's not including if they happen to win both games against their crosstown rivals. This home ground advantage essentially always has them in the running to at least contend for a spot in the final 8 most years. This has always been the case for the team, and you may suggest that any interstate team has the same potential, and I agree that they do. In fact, I wouldn't have said that West Coast has the biggest advantage over the competition if not for my next point. It's in their new stadium, and more importantly, their new training facilities, where they have gained the upper hand over other interstate teams. Optus Stadium offers the same fortress-like coliseum that Subiaco Oval once held, with one massive adjustment: the ground size. In the past, West Coast had deployed game tactics to win at home and ensure a spot in the finals, but would then struggle to adjust to the different sized grounds of the AFL, in particular the larger MCG. With the similar sized Optus Stadium being much closer to that of the MCG and also Docklands, as well as having a training oval the exact same size as the MCG, they no longer have that disadvantage when travelling to Melbourne. It's their ability to make finals and now pose a threat to Melbourne-based teams that I believe makes them the most advantaged team in the AFL. You may be asking yourself then, what about Hawthorn? They have an 87% winning ratio from 6 grand final appearances. And you're absolutely right. The only reason that I haven't named them here is because they have only beaten interstate teams and Geelong in the grand final, never facing off against a Melbourne-based opponent. It's a lack of data that results in my questioning them. They are without a doubt the most successful team over the last 50 years, and have won the most premierships in the AFL era. This, coupled with a huge advantage when playing in Tasmania, should have them in my number 1 spot. But, unfortunately, I don't have any evidence that they have any advantages over other Melbourne-based teams when it comes to the grand final. Do you agree with my deduction? Or do you think there is another team that holds an advantage over the rest of the competition? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to receive notifications when new content goes live. This has been your AFL Access.